What does it mean to be a support? Is it heals, crowd control, buff debuff, or maybe you just simply have to be a supporter class? I think most Arknights players would agree that those are valid definitions of a support unit. Ultimately, the main purpose of support units is to help other operators, making their job easier, safer, and more effective. In this video, we will be talking about Aak, who once was considered one of the worst 6-star operator, turns into one of the best supports in the game. Buffer were already a familiar concept to players even back in the early days of the game, with the existence of Warfarin who combos well with both XQCI and Chen, making full use of XQCI, multi-hit, and Chen's high attack scale modifier. While other buffing methods and targets were known, they were often considered more as a meme, as in practice, deploying another DPS operator is often more effective. This mostly comes from the fact that most of the good DPS units already have built-in attack buff and or high base attack, making those added buffs less significant due to how attack calculation works. This meta remains mostly the same, causing players to often opting into stall meta when there are a lack of damage. This can be reflected by looking at high-risk clear on early CC, such as Magellan and Ethan as the main source of crowd control, sometimes with Feeder or Shao as shifter. Not too long after CC beta, they released Aak, a new 6-star specialist, the first and still only one of its kind under the archetype Geek. Unfortunately, his release was not too bright, as not only buffing was niche, his buffing method have a big drawback comparatively to other buffers, making his buff target very limited or requires a lot of unnecessary setup. Before going on about what changed, let's first take a short look about what he does. For a buffer, he surprisingly has a decent stats, especially for a range operator, with his base attack slightly higher than anti-air sniper while having similar deployment costs, making him often referred to as a pseudo-sniper. Additionally, he boasts one of the highest HP among all range operators. However, his trait drains 30% of his HP every second, which can mislead others into thinking he's tankier than what he actually is. Luckily, his talent helps offset this trait by enabling him to potentially regain his health, inflict extra damage, or even crowd control. That said, the random nature of this talent can make it less reliable, especially off skill. However, it is decently effective when taking his skill into account, mainly being his first and third skill. Aak's first skill is a significant attack speed buff that nearly cuts his attack interval in half with a 50% uptime. When paired with his talent, it turns Aak into a reliable single-target crowd control. This skill is usually the go-to when utilizing his pseudo-sniper role. That said, his second and third skill are when he truly becomes a support operator. Because of its similarities, I will not delve too deeply into each skill and instead focus more on his third skill. Both his second and third skill provides buff to himself and an ally, with the second skill increasing HP and defense, and the third skill increasing attack and attack speed. These buffs are actually quite good for what it's worth. However, the cost of getting it can be quite heavy. Aak must first hit the targeted ally 15 times with 500 physical attack. This is not much of an issue for his second skill, as it is typically used to synergize with defenders, particularly Bubble, whose skill scales over defense. It can also be used to supply more SP on this comp. This strategy was used in CCA, with the former being used to snipe one of the Lazurite archer. His third skill, his main bread and butter, provides the strongest buff in the game. While the increased attack might sound good in theory, in practice it may not be as effective on most units. This is because many DPS operators already have high built-in attack buff from their own skill, making the buff have diminishing returns. The real strength of this skill is in its ASPD buff. As one of the few attack speed buffer in the game, the amount of buff it provides is incredibly massive, with a 50 ASPD increase often directly translates to 50% more DPS. With all that said, he unfortunately did not get much attention back when he was first released. This is mainly due to the fact that many DPS operators were mostly ranged, making it harder for Aak's buff to be effective, as it would require extra support from signing skill tree. The main target for this skill were mostly guards, such as Silveras and Gallagher, or the secret tech Aak and Manticore. Additionally, early CC had squad size risk, which favored operators with multiple roles. With that background laid, what exactly caused Aak to rise from being one of the least popular 6-star operator to a premier support whose buff is now one of the first things people seek out, especially in CC. I believe there were 3 reasons for this. The first is pretty simple. They released more cards, and by that I mean they released more ground DPS operator who deal similar if not more than existing range operator. Firstly, the release of Surtr, who deals massive AoE arch damage. Then there's Mlynar, which has great interaction with her invulnerable phase on S3. Mountain with its shift cancel capability. And recently, there's Horn, Spectre, Gabriel, and best of them all, Mlynar, who all benefits a lot from the buff and can easily tank his burst while still maintaining some survivability. With all this new operator that rose to the rank of DPS units, Aak has become more viable as his biggest weakness has now become mostly irrelevant. The second reason is that the buffers have become more viable. While it might seem like buffer and debuffer goes hand in hand, that's not quite the full picture. Debuffers are usually easier to use than buffers, because the impact you get from debuffing enemies are often greater than using buffers. This makes debuffers the first choice when trying to increase damage, especially with operators like Suzerain, Zarya, Summer, Gnosis, and Art. Additionally, debuffers like Suzerain and Gnosis are strong support in their own right, providing crowd control in the form of slow and freeze, which is an extra utility that most other buffers don't have. Buffers on the other hand, consisting mainly of Barbarian, Bards, and Aak, with the first two having limited target, mostly being ranged operators, don't bring that much else after their buff. In high-range CC, you obviously would want both, but when you don't, bringing in the buffer is usually more efficient. With the increased viability of the buffers, Aak's buff has become more impactful for DPS units, as can be seen in many high-range CC clear, where Aak is the common choice, particularly in scenarios where it is needed to burst down enemies. Which then comes to my next and final point. The third and final reason is the shift in C-series meta. You've heard it a lot of times from my other video, but the play limit risk is prevalent nowadays, while squad size risk is falling out of favor. This risk favors operators that can go in and out quickly while keeping deployment costs low, and requiring operators to have comfortable SP costs. Attack down risk is also present in almost every CC, especially newer ones. This on top of attack speed down, defense, and rest up makes it much harder to burst enemies, often forces players to opt for stall strategies. However, there are times when stalling is not possible, making burst the only viable strategy in which you would want as many buff and debuff operators as possible within the limitation of deploying squad. Additionally, SP risk has seen a resurgence, making operators with high SP costs or low initial SP less favorable due to slow skill cycling. All of this shift in risk meta favors Aak gameplay more and more, which is reflected in his increasing usage since CC4. Overall, these are the reasons I can think of for Aak's increase in popularity. There may be more reasons that I missed, so please let me know in the comments. I wouldn't say he's the best support overall compared to others like Suzerain. However, he's definitely one of the top contenders for CC.